I've had a lot of requests to cover my image processing workflow from the beginning, and I've decided it's time to go ahead and work on that. Some of the requests have been to cover how to process information from color cameras and some from mono. There are many similarities in the two developing processes, though mono processing takes a few extra steps because to create a color image, you will end up with multiple masters, one for each color channel or narrowband channel, and sometimes a luminance channel depending on what approach you are using. I've decided to focus this series on processing data from a mono camera using LRGB filters. The concepts can easily be transferred over to processing OSC information. You would just skip the steps to be covered in part 2 of this series on color balancing, star alignment, and channel combination. The photo editors I'll be using are PixInsight and Affinity Photo. I'll also be using the RC Astro exterminators. If you want to follow the techniques covered in this video precisely, you will need those applications. However, I won't be covering just the techniques for developing in this video, but also the theory, explaining why each developing choice is made. Because there are other good applications out there for developing astro images, such as Serial for early processing, and GIMP and Photoshop for non-destructive layer-based advanced processing. And if you understand the theory behind the editing choices, then you can apply that theory in those other editors. So with that said, let's dive in and get developing. After a night of imaging, an astrophotographer finds him or herself with a pile of information, namely calibration frames and lights. The lights are files or images of whatever target was shot through the night. And calibration frames are intended to remove certain errors in those images. For right now, let's deal with those lights. Using a Player 1 Aries M mono camera shooting LRGB through a Celestron 8-inch or 203mm Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, I shoot 60-second subs. This means during a short summer night, I can easily end up with 300 to 500 subs, and during a long winter night, twice that. Now, some of those subs will have errors. Perhaps a breeze might have blown and buffeted about the telescope a bit. Or perhaps the temperature rapidly changed, changing focus. Or there were changes high up in the atmosphere that created errors in a sub. So what I need to do first of all is determine which are the best subs. And to do this well, I'm going to use what I consider to be one of the best and most powerful tools in PixInsight. It's one of the reasons that I use PixInsight, the SubFrameSelector. The SubFrameSelector will assess your subs and allow you to measure them by a number of standards such as the count of stars or FWHM and help you determine which subs are the best and which you need to get rid of. Alright, let's go ahead and open up the SubFrameSelector. I still have some files in it from the last round of subs I was processing, so I'll just clear them out now. Now I'm going to set up the SubFrameSelector for a new round of assessment. First of all, I need to set the routine to measure subframes, since the first step in this process is subframe assessment. Then, in the subframe scale, I need to enter in the arcseconds per pixel that my camera was shooting at. That is 0.61 arcseconds per pixel. Let's look at how I calculated this. At a website, astronomy.tools, I went to the CCD calculator section, and at the very top, you see the CCD resolution calculator. To get the CCD resolution, you simply enter the pixel size of your camera. In the case of the Player 1 Aries M with the Sony IMX533 sensor, that's 3.76 microns per pixel. And you also enter the telescope focal length. If your telescope has a reducer or some kind of corrector on it, then you need to enter the focal length with the correction. So I have a reducer corrector on the Celestron SCT, and with the correction, that telescope has a whopping 1280mm focal length. So the formula is pixel size over telescope focal length times 206.265. You can see the formula that's used on the upper right and just calculate it for yourself if you want. But those variables yield a resolution of 0.61 arcseconds per pixel. Then I need to pop down to the camera resolution drop-down menu and change the resolution to 14-bit because the Player 1 Aries M is a 14-bit camera. I leave all the other settings in the SubFrameSelector at default, just letting it know the arcseconds per pixel and that the camera sensor is shooting 14-bit images is enough for the SubFrameSelector to do a very good job in assessing the images. Now, before we begin actually assessing data, there's one other bit of preparation that has to be done. The SubFrameSelector needs an output directory to put the culled frames into. So in the folder where last night's astrophotography images are kept, I'm going to create a new directory and name it SFS for SubFrameSelector. Then back in PixInsight under the SFS window, I'll navigate to the Output Files section, and beside Directory, click on the folder icon. Then, in the Windows Explorer that opens, I'll navigate to the SFS folder that I just made under the June 28th information folder. Then I'll click Select Folder, and SFS will note to output any accepted subs into that folder. Then, back in the SubFrameSelector window in PixInsight, I'm going to click the Add Files button. Then I'm going to navigate over to the Lights directory, and here I'll find a couple hundred LRGB lights all mixed together. It's important to only assess images from one filter type at a time, so in the search window upper right, I'll segregate out everything but the Luminance filters. This is easy to do because I set up Nina to name each sub according to which filter was used and the length of exposure. So in that search window, I'll type *0L60, which tells the window to show any files with the letters and numbers 0L60. And all the images shown will have been shot through the Luminance filter and are 60 seconds long. Then I'll click on one of them and hit Ctrl-A to select all of them, and then click the Open button and they will all be added to the SubFrameSelector. In the SubFrameSelector, we can see that it's added 150 lights filmed last night. Now I'll click the small circle to the lower left of the SubFrameSelector box to activate the process, and it will begin assessing all the Luminance subs. That's going to take a moment, so I'll just speed on through it. When the process is done, it will produce two new windows, a measurements window and an expressions window. We'll use the measurements window to find which subs we're going to cull, and we'll use the expressions window if there are a lot of subs to work with. Since the Luminance channel produced 150 subs last night, we'll use the expressions box on the Luminance subs. However, when the subframe assessment has finished its assessment, it will always default by suggesting a call of the subs based on a star count. I wish it wouldn't do that because I always have to go into the expressions box and delete the expressions and hit the right triangle to have it execute the box with no expressions to remove the assessment's default call of the subs. Now that the expressions have been removed and no subs have been called, I'm going to assess the images first by looking at the FWHM. All the way to the left, beneath the words Measurement Graphed, I'll click on the drop-down menu and select FWHM. Notice the graph shows a darker gray bar and a lighter gray bar. The darker gray bar is information within the first standard deviation, and the lighter gray bar is information within the second standard deviation. I will typically accept any information within the first and second standard deviations. With the current settings, you only need to study the upper side of this graph to find the information that you're looking for, those subframes that exceed the second standard deviation. And it turns out that under the FWHM category, all the subframes fall within the second standard deviation, so we're good to go. By the way, you could say that the FWHM category is essentially assessing the focus of an image. But since all this information is good, at least in the FWHM category, let's move on to the next category, eccentricity. Here, we can see that several subs fall above the second standard deviation, so I'm going to use the expressions editor to remove them. In the expressions editor, I'm going to type the word eccentricity, space, less than, space, and then, following the blue line graph, I'm going to find a sub just above the second standard deviation, and when I hover the mouse cursor over it, a gray information box will appear. I'll find the eccentricity rating. I'll enter just a hair below that rating to the right of the less than sign in the expressions box. So I've entered an eccentricity value less than 0.7569. So any sub with an eccentricity rating above 0.7569 will be called. And on the expressions box, when I hit the right-facing triangle, that expression is actioned. You can see the subs marked as called on the graph, where red X's appear over them. The third parameter I like to assess by is the median. Eccentricity often rules out by star shape, but eccentricity and median can both also rule out images that are suffering from cloud cover or fog, and some clouds rolled in an hour or so before nautical dawn, and we can see that represented in the measurement graph, where the median rises well above the second standard deviation toward the right. So to enter another expression, you have to enter a double ampersand after the previous expression, and then return, and on the line below, I'll hit median, less than, and find the lowest median score above the second standard deviation and enter that. Then hit the right triangle to action it. And now we can see all the subs that were above the second standard deviation of median have also been removed. If you want to visually inspect a sub that has been removed, you can double-click on it in the list, and the sub will open. You can hit Ctrl-A as I just did to apply a screen transfer function stretch, and when we do, we can see that these stars are irregular in shape. I don't know why, but they're irregular and they had to be removed. Now the last parameter that we're going to use to assess the images is the star count. Now the expression for the star count is stars greater than, and this means you want to look at the underside of the graph. And here, I'm less inclined to simply say, well, these stars are beyond the second standard deviation, or even just beyond the first standard deviation. Rather, what I'll do is trace the mouse up and down the blue line and find any place where there is a sudden and significant decrease in the number of stars. And I interpret that as meaning something, probably a cloud, got in the way of the telescope. Then I'll take notice of the number of stars on the greater side of the sudden decline, and in the expressions editor, enter greater than that number minus 1, thereby calling any subs with a star count below that sudden drop. And that removes subs that have probably been blocked by clouds or fog. In this case, I decided to block any subs with star counts lower than 295. When that's all done, I'll go to the Routines drop-down box and select Output, which tells the SubFrameSelector to output the acceptable subs into that SFS menu that I created a few minutes ago. Then at the bottom of the SubFrameSelector window, I'll hit the blue circle and action the output. Now we'll do this whole process again with the subs from the red filter. But since there will be a lot less subs from the red filter, we won't use the expressions editor. You can actually click subs out using the graph in the measurements window. So I'm going to clear out all the light subs by clicking the clear button in the SubFrameSelector main window, then click the add button, and in the Windows Explorer filter button, I'll hit star 0R60, and this will filter out everything but the red 60-second subs. Then I'll click on one of those subs and hit Ctrl-A to select all of them, and hit the open button, and they will appear in the SubFrameSelector window. I'll make sure that the routine drop-down list is set for measure subs and hit the circle action icon again, and the SubFrameSelector will measure the red subs. And after a couple minutes, once again, a Measurements and Expressions window will appear. I'll clear the expressions out of the Measurements window, then hit the right action triangle in the Expressions window to undo any called subs. Now in the Measurements window, we'll start the assessment process again by taking a look at the FWHM. We can see only one single peak above the second standard deviation of the FWHM. And when I click on it, you can see in the drop-down list that sub is highlighted in yellow, and to the left an X appears and a lock. This means it has been X'd out or culled from the list of acceptable subs. This is how you manually call subs. It is important when manually calling subs like this to drag the mouse cursor up and down the entire length of any blue line appearing over the second standard deviation, because subs don't just appear at the points, they can also appear along the line, and they won't be visible unless you pass the mouse cursor over them. Let's go ahead and measure eccentricity now. So I've clicked eccentricity in the drop-down list, and I'm going to slide the mouse cursor up and down the blue line where it appears over the second standard deviation, and anytime a circle appears, I've found a sub. I'm going to click on that circle, and that sub will be called from the list. When working with just a few subs, say under 50 to 100, this is the fastest way to remove those subs. I'll go back down to the drop-down list and select median, but we can see that under the median parameter, all the subs fall within the first two standard deviations. So finally, we'll assess by stars. I'm going to trace the mouse down the blue line and look for any sudden reductions in stars, which I will interpret as clouds or mist passing in front of the stars. If there are a lot of subs that fall below that number, then I'll write an expression to remove those subs. However, there are only a few, so I'll just manually click them out. In the measurements window to the upper left, we can see that we have accepted 31 out of 40 of our subs. And in the SubFrameSelector main window, I'll select the Output Subframes routine and then action the process. And now, all the acceptable red subs will also be output into the SFS folder. Now I'm not going to show it, but I'm going to do the exact same thing with the blue and green filters. Let's move on. Once finished culling subs with the SubFrameSelector, it's time to prepare the subs for stacking. At this point, I have information from 3 separate nights. The information from those nights will have to each be stacked separately with their own calibration frames and then combined in final stacking. When dealing with multiple nights of data like this, I create a temporary hold folder where I segregate the data from different nights into subfolders labeled night_1, night_2, and so on, so that the weighted batch preprocessor script, which we'll use for stacking, can keep track of the separate information and what belongs to what. The information must go into folders with a common name and a differentiating numeric marker. Now I already have the common folder created, where I've put information from a previous 2 nights of photon collection. I'll go ahead and open it now. Once open, I'll make a new subfolder called night_3 to hold the new information, and all the information gathered on the night of June 28th will be put into there. Bias subs will go in under their own folder called biases, flats will go in under their own folder called flats, and the lights that survive the culling process are now in the SFS subfolder from the June 28th night, so that SFS folder will also go into night_3. When all the information is transferred and in place, I need to create one more folder. The weighted batch preprocessor will require an output folder. So I'll create an output folder and label it prox 3 days data. In the PixInsight scripts drop-down menu, I'll select batch processing and the weighted batch preprocessor. And a moment later the script will open. Look over the right side of the weighted batch preprocessing scripts window toward the middle. You can see there a section called grouping keywords. Those keywords are how the script knows what information to keep with what. So the common name between all the folder names is night. So I've already added night to the list. That tells the weighted batch preprocessor script to segregate the information based on the folder name of night. Any information found in a folder with the name night is to be kept together. So all the calibration frames and light frames found under folder night_1 is processed together, and all the information found under the folder night_2 is also processed together, and so on. This is especially important in regard to calibration frames. The calibration frames from one night are not necessarily useful with the lights from another night. So the weighted batch preprocessor will process all the information according to its own night folder, and when it's done creating all that initial information, it'll then put all the final images together in a final master, or in this case, 4 final masters because I shot the nebula in LRGB, so I'll get a master for luminance and a master for red, green, and blue separately. In the global options, I'm going to purge the cache from the previous project, and then in the output directory box, I'll go ahead and select the prox 3 days folder that I just created. And now the weighted batch preprocessor knows to output its files into that folder. When that's done, on the bottom left I can click the directory button and select the equal to stacked folder where I've already pre-sorted all the information from nights 1, night 2, and night 3. Click select folder and the weighted batch preprocessor will sort all of those files, over 1,000 files in just a moment, into the appropriate calibration sections, light sections, and tabs. When the process is done, we'll get a list showing how many files were placed. Scrolling down the list, we can see that it quickly segregated and placed 1,040 files. Doing things that way saved a lot of time. Manually placing all the calibration, bias, and light frames where they belonged would have been tedious and taken a while. But once the folders have been set and segregated into place, I like to visually look everything over and make sure the weighted batch preprocessor did everything right. There's a lot of possibilities for errors to crop up, but the most common error is simply to do something wrong in the naming of a subfolder, subframes, or calibration frames, which can throw off the sorting process. In this case though, under the various categories, we can see that everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. Now there are just a couple last things to do. I'm going to pop over to the post-calibration section, click the checkbox to enable drizzling, and select drizzling ×2. And when we do, we see that the drizzling command is activated only on the highlighted file which is at the top. But to use the drizzled files, this will have to be applied to all of them. So I'll also click on the Apply to All Groups button. And now in the list on the left, we can see that all the files will be drizzled ×2. We can now click Run the Stacker, and a diagnostics messages box will appear. If there are no errors preventing you from carrying on, just click Continue. And a WBPP execution monitor window will pop up. And if you want, you can stretch this monitor so you can better view the entire stacking process. Now it's going to take about 2 hours for the weighted batch preprocessor to complete all the operations. But when it does, we'll be left with 8 masters, 4 drizzled and 4 non-drizzled. We're going to take the 4 drizzled masters and begin early processing in PixInsight. But that's a topic to be covered in the next video on this series. So I hope you join me next time to go further into my complete process and workflow for processing LRGB information. remembering that the same principles can be applied just as well to one-shot color information and narrowband. Hope to see you around next time, and if you have any thoughts or comments on this video, or any particular questions that you want to go over, just leave them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, thanks for taking a moment to like and subscribe, and for helping this channel to just grow so much so fast. I'm just so grateful to everybody. I can't believe how fast and how much this channel has grown. Alright, it's getting dark here, and I'm hoping for clear skies, so it's time to get the observatory ready. Because when the sun goes down, it's time to get out there and shoot the sky.